Have you ever stopped to think, what if the story of Jesus didn't begin in Bethlehem? What if the birth in the manger was just one chapter and not the first? This idea seems almost impossible, doesn't it? Since childhood, we've learned that Jesus' life began with Mary and Joseph on a starlit night, and that there the greatest story ever told began. But according to revelations made by the so-called sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce, this might not be the whole truth. He claims that Jesus had already walked this world in other eras, in other forms, preparing for the mission we know from the Gospels. This revelation changes everything. Because if it's true, it means that the figure of Jesus not only marked history at a specific point, but was present at different crucial moments of humanity, guiding, learning, and purifying himself until that night in Bethlehem. The question that remains is, how can we accept something so grand when everything we've heard throughout our lives has been different? I know this might sound uncomfortable. Most of us were raised within religious traditions that don't make space for the idea of Jesus reincarnating before being Jesus, but it is precisely this provocation that makes this reflection so powerful. Because deep down, it's not about denying what we've learned, but about expanding, looking beyond the walls of what has already been established. Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, left thousands of spiritual readings made in a trance state. Among many revelations about health, spirituality, and the future, he also spoke about the figure of Jesus. For Cayce, the Christ we know traversed a long journey of past lives, appearing as characters who shaped the course of history until he achieved the perfection of consciousness necessary to assume the mission of Savior. And this is where our pact in this conversation begins. I'm not here to impose beliefs. I'm here to invite you to a profound reflection, guided by curiosity. You don't need to agree immediately. Just walk with me along this line of reasoning. Because at the end of this journey, perhaps you will realize that the question, did Jesus only live one life, is not just about religion, but about the mystery of existence and the role each of us plays in this great cycle called life. Think with me. If we believe that the human soul evolves, if we accept that each life is a chance for learning, would it make sense for the greatest soul that ever passed through this world to have only a single opportunity? Or would it make more sense for him to have also gone through trials, errors, and successes to then become the perfect guide? This is the key to Cayce's theory. For him, Jesus incarnated several times before, always on decisive missions, and each of these previous lives was a preparation for the final work we know. Some names he mentions surprise even the most learned scholars, because they link the figure of Jesus to characters from the Old Testament and even from other cultures. Imagine the power of this revelation. Suddenly, stories you've known forever can take on new meaning. And characters who seemed isolated in the biblical narrative connect in a totally unexpected way. But I know what you might be thinking now. Isn't this just an invention? This doubt is natural, and that's why we need to proceed carefully. It's not about blindly accepting, but about exploring together. I will present each of Jesus's supposed incarnations revealed by Cayce, showing the points of connection and how they fit into a line of spiritual evolution. But only at the end will you be in a position to judge whether it makes sense or not. Until then, I invite you to keep an open mind. First, however, let me ask you a direct question. Do you believe that life continues after death? Because if the answer is yes, then the idea of multiple lives is not so far-fetched. It's as if each existence were a chapter of the same book, and some special characters were called to write decisive chapters for all humanity. According to Cayce, this is exactly what happened with Jesus. His soul would have lived several times, always facing increasingly greater trials, until he was ready to become the Christ. Think of it as a great maturation process. Just as a fruit doesn't ripen overnight, a soul can also need many cycles to reach fullness. And why is this important to us? Because if even the greatest master of humanity needed to go through several lives to achieve his mission, what does that tell us about our own path? Suddenly the mistakes we carry, the regrets that weigh on our conscience, cease to be the end of the line. They become stages, parts of a larger process. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. The question I haven't made clear yet is, Who were these figures, these previous lives of Jesus? Edgar Cayce mentions several, some you know by name, others less obvious, and each of them has a direct connection to what would later become the mission of Jesus of Nazareth. Before revealing the first name, I want you to imagine the scene. A young prophet in the Old Testament, someone who struggles with their own flaws and tries to follow God's will, even stumbling. Now think, could this young man be an earlier version of the soul that would one day become Jesus? For Cayce, yes, and that's exactly where our journey begins. But make no mistake, it's not a straight line, it's not a fairy tale. These supposed incarnations show that even the soul of Jesus went through moments of error, of learning, of fall and overcoming. This brings us even closer to him because it shows that his perfection was not something given for free, but conquered over ages. Now, I want you to do a quick exercise. Close your eyes for a moment and ask yourself, what would your vision of Jesus be if you discovered that he lived other lives before the one in Bethlehem? Would it be a cause for shock, of admiration, of hope? This question will accompany us throughout our conversation, because in the end we are not just talking about Jesus, but about the very idea of spiritual evolution. If Cayce is right, the life of Christ was not just the greatest story ever told, it was also the greatest example of persistence and growth that ever existed. The first name cited by Cayce as one of Jesus' incarnations is a well-known and at the same time controversial character, Adam. Yes, Adam, the first man, the one who symbolizes the beginning of humanity in Genesis. This revelation is surprising because, for many, Adam represents precisely the beginning of the fall, the error that brought pain and separation of humanity from God. How then could Jesus have been Adam in a previous life? For Cayce, the explanation is clear. The soul that would later become the Christ began its human journey precisely at the most difficult point, the fall. Think about this for a moment. Adam is described as the first soul to incarnate on earth. According to Cayce, this soul had a direct connection with God, but chose to experience matter, and in that process ended up distancing itself from original spiritual purity. This distancing was not just an individual choice, but a milestone for all humanity. If we accept this perspective, then Jesus' mission, thousands of years later, begins to make even more sense. Christ came precisely to redeem the fall that, according to this view, he himself had initiated as Adam. This creates a powerful narrative line. Imagine an author who writes the first chapter of a story full of flaws, but who, over the centuries, returns to correct, rewrite, and finally deliver the perfect ending. Such would be the journey of Jesus' soul according to Cayce, from Adam to Christ, a cycle of fall and redemption. But Adam was not the only figure. Cayce cites other Old Testament names that carry this same soul in different phases of evolution. One of the most striking is Enoch. Little mentioned in the Bible, Enoch is described as someone who walked with God and who was taken without knowing death. For many scholars, Enoch represents purity and closeness to the divine. For Cayce, this would have been one of the lives in which the soul of Jesus sought to reconcile with the Creator, showing that, after Adam's fall, a path of return was already being built. Notice how intriguing this idea is. On one side we have Adam, a symbol of the fall. On the other, Enoch, a symbol of ascension. In both cases, the soul is the same, but in different stages of learning. This dynamic shows that even the greatest soul in the world went through extremes, error and redemption, distancing and reunion. Now, let me open another door. Cayce also states that this soul lived as Melchizedek, a mysterious figure mentioned in the Old Testament. Melchizedek was both king and priest, someone who appears without a clear genealogy, as if he were timeless. For many biblical scholars, he was already a premonition of Christ. For Cayce, this was not a premonition, it was literally the same soul, already showing its direct connection between humanity and divinity. So far, you might be thinking, but how does all this fit into the story we know? It's a fair question. The Bible, as most of us have learned, presents Jesus as the Son of God sent only once. However, when we look deeper, we realize that there are characters who seem mysteriously greater than their time, almost as if they were pieces of a larger puzzle. Cayce suggests that this puzzle is precisely Jesus' spiritual journey, and the list doesn't stop there. Another name he mentions is Joseph, son of Jacob, the one sold by his brothers and who became governor of Egypt. Think about what Joseph represents. Someone who suffered injustices, was betrayed, but who in the end used his power to save his family and his people. Sound familiar? For Cayce, this life was a preparation for what was to come in Bethlehem, the capacity to forgive, to transform pain into salvation. This is where the pieces begin to fit together more clearly. The soul that began as Adam, falling into error, passes through Enoch, seeking reconnection. It emerges as Melchizedek, uniting the sacred and the earthly, and then as Joseph, learning to forgive and save. Each life is not isolated, but a step on a ladder that leads to Christ. And what does all this mean for us today? It means that perfection does not arise suddenly, not even in the soul we know as Jesus. According to Cayce, it was a long process full of challenges and learning. And this is profoundly human, because if even Christ went through errors and corrections, what about us? Shouldn't we look at our flaws with more compassion, understanding that they are part of a larger path? Now imagine for a moment if this idea were more widespread. How many people would live with less guilt and more hope? Because if even Jesus evolved through several lives, then each of us is also evolving. Our mistakes are not the end, but merely stages. But of course, all this raises a big question. Why has Christian tradition never openly spoken of these possible reincarnations? The answer for Cayce lies in how the scriptures were organized and interpreted over the centuries. Many mysteries were set aside, perhaps because they didn't fit into doctrines that sought simplicity and clarity. But the subtle clues, the mysterious characters, and the repetition of patterns suggest that there is much more hidden in the biblical narrative than we imagine. And if you're intrigued so far, get ready. Because we haven't yet talked about the most surprising incarnations of all, those that connect Jesus to great prophets and leaders who changed the course of the people of Israel. Figures who possess such striking characteristics that, when viewed in this light, indeed seem like direct premonitions of Christ. But before we move on, I want to invite you to a small pause for reflection. If this content is already bringing you value, if it's already awakening new ideas in you, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. This helps keep this journey alive and encourages more people to reflect with us. Now then, let's resume. The next name on this list is perhaps one of the grandest and most controversial, Moses. Yes, the one who freed the Hebrews from Egypt, who received the tablets of the law, and who led an entire people for decades in the desert. For Cayce, Moses would have been another incarnation of the soul that would one day become Jesus. And here the logic reveals itself again. Moses represents the law, the structure, the spiritual organization of a people. Jesus, later, would represent the fulfillment and transcendence of that same law through love. If the same soul traversed these two journeys, it makes sense. First came order, then came fullness. Do you see how this narrative intertwines? Each life is a piece, and when we look at the complete picture, we see a continuous line of evolution. And it is precisely this invisible thread that Cayce invites us to perceive. But let's not reveal everything at once. There are still more names, more stories, and more surprising connections that need to be explored. Each of them brings us closer to understanding how, according to Cayce, the soul we know as Jesus traversed the centuries until that unique moment in Bethlehem. And perhaps the greatest revelation is yet to come. The life in which this soul faced one of the greatest dilemmas ever recorded, an error that needed to be corrected with love and sacrifice. If the incarnations we've mentioned so far, Adam, Enoch, Melchizedek, Joseph, and Moses, already seem surprising, what comes next is even more impressive. Edgar Cayce asserted that Jesus' soul also lived as Joshua, Moses' successor, the one who led the Hebrew people into the promised land. Think about it. Moses was the lawgiver, the conductor of the law. But he didn't actually enter the promised land. It was Joshua who crossed the Jordan, who led the people in conquest, who continued the mission. For Cayce, this shows a clear pattern. The soul that would later become Jesus not only established the law as Moses, but also carried it forward as Joshua. Each life was a logical step, a preparation for the great moment that would come centuries later. This narrative carries a powerful message. The spiritual mission is never interrupted. Even when a leader seems not to complete their work, there is continuity, there is progression. And if we accept this view, the same soul can return in another body to continue what was started. But perhaps Cayce's most shocking revelation isn't Joshua. He also stated that Jesus' soul was present in one of the most contradictory figures in the Bible, King David. Yes, David, the man after God's own heart, but also someone who committed serious errors, including adultery and murder. And here the inevitable question arises: how could Christ have lived as David, someone so marked by flaws? Cayce's answer is simple yet profound, precisely because perfection is not born ready-made. Jesus' soul would have gone through all human experiences, including the most painful falls, to fully understand the human condition. Only then could he become the Savior capable of embracing everyone, without judgment. See the contrast. On one hand, David is remembered as the great king, the one who united Israel, who wrote psalms of praise, who danced before the ark of the Lord. On the other, he is also a man who succumbed to temptations, who erred gravely. For Cayce, this duality does not diminish, but enriches the soul's journey. It shows that even the future Christ needed to pass through shadows before shining in fullness. This perspective can be unsettling, but it also brings a liberating lesson. Because if even Christ made mistakes, who are we to demand immediate perfection from ourselves? Suddenly, our failures cease to be eternal condemnations and become stepping stones for learning, and it doesn't stop there. Another name cited by Cayce is Solomon, David's son, known for his wisdom. Think of the symbolism. First, the soul lives as David, experiencing power and passion, often getting lost in mistaken choices. Then, it is reborn as Solomon, marked by the pursuit of wisdom and discernment. It's as if each life were a correction, a stage of growth. Solomon's famous judgment, in which he proposed dividing the child to discover the true mother, reveals a soul that sought truth through intelligence and justice. For Cayce, this was a necessary stage in the evolution that would culminate in the incarnation as Jesus, the understanding that true wisdom lies not only in law or mind, but in love. When we unite all these incarnations, Adam, Enoch, Melchizedek, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, David, and Solomon, we begin to see a guiding thread. Each life is like a piece of a mosaic. Sometimes the piece seems dark, full of flaws. Other times it shines with virtue and purity. But together, they all form the complete picture, the preparation of the soul to become the Christ. Now, pause for a moment and reflect. What would it be like to view Jesus' life not just as a unique miracle, but as the result of a long journey? This would not diminish his greatness, but amplify it, because it would show that his perfection was earned, not simply granted. And here arises one of the greatest lessons from Cayce's teaching. Salvation is not just about what Jesus did for us, but also about the example of his own evolution. If even he traveled a road full of falls and triumphs, that means we too can walk this path, step by step. But there is still another revelation that Cayce lets slip, perhaps the most challenging of all. He claims that Jesus' soul was also present in a controversial figure who would have committed one of the greatest errors in biblical history. And precisely for this reason he would need to return as Christ to atone. Here I pause, because this is the kind of information that can be shocking, but also can open our eyes to a new understanding. According to Cayce, this soul would have lived as Amalek, one of Israel's enemies, a king marked by violence. The idea seems unthinkable. How could Christ have been an enemy? But Cayce explains, this incarnation would represent one of the lowest points in this soul's journey, a moment when it let itself be carried away by darkness and power. And precisely for this reason, it would later need to offer itself in total sacrifice, giving itself as a ransom for humanity. See the spiritual logic behind it. If the fall began in Adam, and if it went through errors in David, and even a plunge into darkness as Amalek, then coming as Jesus would be the pinnacle of redemption, not just saving others, but also redeeming the soul's entire own trajectory. This is a profound and even uncomfortable point, but it brings a lesson. No soul is forever lost. If even a soul that went through very serious errors could become the Christ, this means that every human being has within them the same possibility of redemption. And this is precisely what makes this teaching so powerful for us today. Many people live feeling trapped by the past, marked by errors that seem unforgivable. But according to this view, no matter the magnitude of the fall, there is always the possibility of rising. Now think with me. If you could look back at your life and see not just errors, but stages of learning, how would that change your way of living today? This is the message hidden in Cayce's theory of Jesus' incarnations. We arrive finally at the central moment of this journey, Bethlehem. After traversing centuries in different forms, going through falls, victories, wisdom, and even shadows, the soul that Cayce describes as having lived so many times finally is reborn as Jesus, Son of Mary. And here is the key to the revelation. For Cayce, this birth was not just the beginning of Christ's life, but the result of an entire process of spiritual evolution that had begun much earlier. Think of it as a great preparation. Each previous life was a lesson, a rehearsal, a refinement. As Adam, this soul knew the fall. As Enoch, it sought closeness with God. As Melchizedek, it united the sacred and the earthly. As Joseph, it learned to forgive. As Moses, it structured the law. As Joshua, it led the people to conquest. As David, it experienced glory and fall. As Solomon, it sought wisdom. Even in the darkest roles, this soul knew the extremes of the human condition. And when all this was lived, the time came to incarnate as Jesus, the Christ, full consciousness in human form. It's as if all the pieces of the puzzle, scattered across centuries, came together on a single night, under a star in Bethlehem. There, not just a boy was born, but the result of a long history of errors and lessons, ready to offer the world not just words, but the living example of overcoming and love. And perhaps this is the most important part. For Cayce, what makes Jesus so great is not just being the Son of God in a mystical sense, but being the living example that even the highest soul needed to tread a path of evolution. This does not diminish his greatness. On the contrary, it draws us even closer to him, because it shows us that Christ understands every pain, every flaw, every human fall. He went through it. Now imagine the impact of this idea for those who live in fear of judgment, for those who carry deep regrets. Knowing that even Jesus traveled a road full of challenges can open a door of hope. Because if he needed several lives to reach perfection, we also have time, chances, and opportunities. Life is not a speed race, but a path of patience and persistence. This vision also explains why Jesus' message has so much power. He did not speak from above as someone distant. He spoke from within the human experience, because he had already passed through every extreme, from Adam's fall to David's throne, from Solomon's wisdom to the full love of Christ. When he said, "I have overcome the world," this was not just a spiritual phrase, but the synthesis of a journey of centuries. And here a question arises: why are Cayce's revelations not widely accepted? The answer may lie in 2 points. First, because they challenge consolidated doctrines. The idea that Jesus lived multiple lives confronts centuries of tradition that present him as unique and absolute in his earthly incarnation. Second, because not everyone is ready for a vision that places spiritual evolution as something universal, encompassing even Christ. To accept this is to accept that life is much broader and more complex than we imagine. But regardless of whether we agree or not, we cannot deny that this reflection touches something deep within us. It speaks of what we all seek, the certainty that our flaws are not the end. And in this sense, Cayce's message connects with the essence of Jesus' message. After all, Christ taught us precisely this, that there is always forgiveness, that there is always a new beginning, that death is not the end. Now let me propose an exercise in imagination. Imagine that you are standing before the child Jesus in Bethlehem. But instead of seeing him only as the beginning of a life, you see behind him the entire line of incarnations that Cayce described. You see Adam, you see Joseph, you see Moses, you see David. All there like steps that led to that moment. How would this change your understanding of that birth? Perhaps in this view, the birth in Bethlehem ceases to be just an isolated scene and becomes the culmination of a long story of redemption. And if so, then it also means that each of our births can be part of a larger story that we do not yet understand. This is the final point, and at the same time the starting point, that Cayce invites us to consider. No matter how many lives we've had, no matter how many mistakes we've made, there is always a chance to evolve. There is always a chance to transform, and perhaps this is the message you needed to hear today. How many times have you felt stuck in the past, thinking there was no way out? How many times have you thought your flaws were too great? If even Jesus' soul, according to Cayce, went through errors before reaching Christ, why would it be different for us? Deep down, this is a message of hope, because it reminds us that life continues, that we will always have new opportunities, and that our essence is destined to grow. And here I return to the question I asked at the beginning. Do you think Jesus only lived one life? Perhaps after this journey the answer is not so simple. Perhaps the question is not yes or no, but rather what it awakens in us. If this story is true, it shows us that even the greatest soul had to walk a long way to become what it was. If not, it still inspires us to believe that our lives, however difficult, are part of something greater. The important thing is not just to decide whether or not we believe Cayce's revelations. The important thing is what we do with this reflection now. And here is my final invitation. If this video brought value to you, if it sparked new questions and made you reflect on your own journey, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. In this way, you help this message reach more people who are also searching for meaning. Ultimately, the story of Jesus' incarnations, according to Edgar Cayce, is more than a theory. It is a mirror for each of us. It is a reminder that our falls are not definitive and that our destiny is to evolve. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is the true legacy of Christ, to show us through his own trajectory that all of us are on a path of return to the divine.